On the night of September 28th, 2000, David Camm was thinking about something completely ordinary. He was driving home from a church basketball game in southern Indiana, running a little later than expected. The drive would take only a few minutes, and he already knew what conversation awaited him when he got there. His wife, Kim, would probably remind him that Bradley had school in the morning. Jill needed her routine too. Thursday night basketball had become a tradition, but family schedules still mattered. It was the kind of disagreement married couples have every day and forget by the next morning. David had no idea that, just a few miles away, everything he loved had already been taken from him. What happened next would become one of the most controversial criminal cases in American history. A case involving a murdered family, a former police officer, questionable forensic science, a convicted serial offender, and a justice system that would spend more than a decade trying to prove a conclusion it reached before all the evidence was even collected. To understand how it happened, you have to start long before the flashing lights, the courtroom battles, and the headlines. You have to start with the life David Camm thought he had built. Georgetown, Indiana, was the kind of town where everybody seemed to know everybody. With a population of just over 2,000 people, it felt more like an extended neighborhood than a town. Families stayed for generations. Roads carried family names. Neighbors waved from passing cars. People felt safe there. David Camm grew up with deep roots in that community. In 1984, he met a young woman named Kimberly Wren. Friends described Kim as intelligent, hardworking, and deeply caring. David later said he was immediately drawn to her. The relationship grew steadily. 5 years later, they married. From the outside, their future looked bright. David joined the Indiana State Police in 1989 and quickly established a reputation as a capable officer. He eventually earned a place on the department's elite emergency response team, a position reserved for officers who demonstrated exceptional performance and discipline. Kim built a successful career of her own, eventually becoming a senior accountant. Together, they created the kind of life many people spend years chasing. A home, a family, a stable career, a respected place in the community. In 1993, they welcomed their son Bradley. 2 years later came their daughter Jill. By the late 1990s, the family appeared to have everything. David coached youth sports. Kim balanced work and family life. The children were active and thriving. They built a beautiful home on Lockhart Road, a street connected to David's own family history. It looked like the American dream. Then, in the spring of 2000, things appeared to get even better. After 10 years with the Indiana State Police, David accepted a position with a family-owned business. The new job offered significantly more income and something even more valuable, time. No more unpredictable police schedules. No more late-night emergency calls. More evenings at home. More weekends with the children. More family dinners. To friends and relatives, it seemed like the beginning of a new chapter. Nobody could have imagined how quickly that chapter would end. September 28th, 2000, began like any other day. David went to work. Kim went to work. Bradley and Jill went to school. There was nothing unusual, nothing alarming, nothing to suggest that by the end of the night, 3 members of the Camm family would be dead. After school, Kim picked up the children. Bradley attended swim practice. The family returned home. Meanwhile, David headed to Georgetown Community Church for his regular Thursday night basketball game. It was routine. The same gym, the same group of men, the same schedule. Around 7 p.m., the games began. For the next several hours, the men played basketball, talked, laughed, and enjoyed another ordinary Thursday evening. At approximately 9:20 p.m., the games ended. David got into his vehicle and started the short drive home. Nothing felt unusual. Nothing felt wrong. As he pulled into the driveway, he pressed the garage door opener. The door began to rise. And within seconds, his life changed forever. The first thing he noticed was movement on the floor. Then he realized it wasn't movement at all. It was his wife. Kim was lying in the garage, covered in blood, motionless. David jumped from his vehicle and rushed toward her. He called her name. He dropped beside her. But almost immediately, he understood something terrible. She was gone. Then another thought struck him with overwhelming force. The children. Where were the children? His eyes shifted toward the family's Ford Bronco parked inside the garage. What he saw next would haunt him for the rest of his life. Jill was still inside, strapped into her seat. She, too, was gone. Bradley was nearby, his body positioned as though he had tried desperately to escape. As though, in his final moments, he had been attempting to climb away from whatever horror had unfolded inside that garage. David rushed to him. Bradley still felt warm. In a panic, he pulled his son from the vehicle and began CPR. Again and again, refusing to accept what was happening, refusing to stop. Because when a parent finds a child like that, logic disappears. Hope takes over, even when hope no longer has a chance. But there was nothing he could do. Within moments, David Camm found himself standing in a garage containing the bodies of his wife, his son, and his daughter. An entire life erased in a single evening. And he had no idea that investigators were already beginning to suspect him. When police arrived, they encountered one of the most disturbing crime scenes many of them had ever witnessed. 3 victims, a devastated husband and father, blood throughout the garage, questions everywhere. But among all the evidence, 2 items stood out immediately. One was a gray sweatshirt found near Bradley's body. The sweatshirt did not belong to David. It did not belong to Kim. It did not belong to either child. Written inside the collar was a single word: backbone. At the time, nobody knew how important that sweatshirt would become. The second item was even stranger. Kim's shoes. Instead of being on her feet, they had been carefully placed on top of the Bronco, neatly arranged, side by side, almost as though someone had intentionally displayed them. Investigators could not explain it. Yet despite these unusual discoveries, attention quickly shifted toward one person: David Camm. Within days, investigators began building a theory that would shape the next 13 years. A theory that would eventually place a grieving father on trial for the murder of his own family. And once that theory took hold, nearly every piece of evidence would be interpreted through a single question: how do we prove David Camm did this? Not, who killed the Camm family? But, how do we prove it was David? And that difference would change everything. Who killed the Camm family? But, how do we prove it was David? And that difference would change everything. In the first hours after the murders, investigators faced a difficult question. Who could have done this? 3 members of the same family had been killed inside a garage in a quiet Indiana community. There were no obvious signs of a forced entry. No clear suspect was standing in front of them. At least, not yet. But before the night was over, many of the people responsible for the investigation had already begun looking in one direction: toward David Camm. Floyd County Prosecutor Stan Faith arrived at the scene and surveyed the garage. The bodies, the blood, the devastated husband, the former state trooper. And according to numerous accounts that would emerge later, the focus of the investigation quickly narrowed. Instead of treating David as one possibility among many, investigators increasingly began treating him as the answer. The investigation would now work backward from that assumption. The challenge was proving it. And for that, they needed forensic evidence. To help interpret the crime scene, prosecutors sought assistance from blood-spatter experts. One of the names contacted was Rod Englert, a nationally known analyst with experience in crime scene reconstruction. Englert could not personally respond to the scene. Instead, an associate named Robert Stites became involved. At first glance, that might not have seemed unusual. Crime investigations often rely on specialists. But years later, Stites would become one of the most controversial figures in the entire case. At the time, however, few people questioned his conclusions, and his conclusions would shape everything that followed. As part of the investigation, David voluntarily surrendered the clothing he had been wearing during the basketball game. Among those items was a t-shirt. When laboratory testing was completed, analysts identified several tiny blood spots near the lower portion of the shirt. There were only a handful of them, small enough that they were barely noticeable. But Robert Stites believed they told an important story. He argued that the stains represented what is known as high-velocity impact spatter. In simple terms, he claimed the blood droplets had been created when a firearm discharged at close range. According to his interpretation, the blood had traveled through the air and landed on David's shirt during the shootings. If true, it would place David near at least one of the victims at the moment the fatal shots were fired. It was exactly the kind of evidence investigators had been searching for. Stites was not tentative. He was not uncertain. He spoke with confidence. Absolute confidence. Investigators documented his findings. Prosecutors embraced them. And before long, those tiny blood spots became the foundation of the state's entire theory. But the blood stains were only the beginning. Stites examined additional areas of the garage and began identifying what he believed were signs of violent gunfire throughout the scene. He pointed to various surfaces, blood patterns, objects within the garage. He interpreted them as evidence supporting a shooting carried out at close range. The more he looked, the more evidence he seemed to find. Every observation strengthened the same conclusion. David Camm was the killer. For prosecutors, it appeared to be a breakthrough. For David, it was the beginning of a nightmare. There was one major problem. Actually, there were 11 of them. 11 witnesses. Every one of them had been at the church basketball game. Every one of them said David was there. And every one of them placed him at the church during the period when investigators believed the murders occurred. This wasn't a single friend offering an alibi. It wasn't a family member. It wasn't one person with a questionable memory. It was an entire group of people who independently described the same thing. David had been playing basketball. The medical examiner's estimated timeline placed the deaths during the period when those games were underway. If the witnesses were correct, David couldn't have been at the crime scene. At least not according to the timeline. Investigators responded by modifying their theory. Instead of accepting the alibi, they suggested David had briefly slipped away. According to this scenario, he left the church unnoticed, drove home, murdered his wife and children, and then returned to the basketball game before anyone realized he was gone. The timeline was incredibly tight. The drive itself consumed most of the available window. That left only a few minutes for everything else. 3 murders, scene staging, departure, return, all without a single witness noticing. Yet despite the obvious challenges, investigators continued moving forward. Because by this point, they believed they had science on their side. And in court, science often carries enormous weight. Then investigators found something else. A telephone record, a call originating from the Camm residence. At first glance, it appeared to place David at home during a period when he claimed to be elsewhere. For prosecutors, it seemed like confirmation. Perhaps the alibi wasn't as solid as it appeared. Perhaps David had lied. But the excitement didn't last. When experts examined the records more carefully, they discovered a problem involving time zone calculations within the phone company's system. The call had been logged incorrectly. After the correction, the timeline changed completely. Instead of contradicting David's account, the call actually supported it. What initially looked like evidence against him turned out to be entirely routine. Another lead disappeared. The investigation now faced an uncomfortable reality. There was no murder weapon, no eyewitness placing David at the crime scene, no confession. A difficult timeline, a strong alibi, and a mysterious sweatshirt that belonged to someone else. Yet prosecutors remained convinced they had the right man. If the physical evidence wasn't enough, they would look elsewhere. They would start examining David himself. Not the crime, the man. And what they discovered would become one of the most powerful weapons used against him. Because while investigators struggled to connect David to murder, they found something much easier to prove. He had been a deeply unfaithful husband. And before long, that fact would become central to the state's strategy. Not because it proved murder, but because it could change how a jury viewed him. The question was no longer simply whether David Camm had killed his family. The question was whether jurors could be persuaded to believe a man they no longer respected. And that distinction would prove critical. By the time prosecutors prepared for trial, they knew they had a problem. The timeline was difficult. The alibi was strong. The murder weapon had never been found. And despite months of investigation, there was still no direct evidence proving David Camm had pulled a trigger. But prosecutors believed they had something that could overcome all of that. They had a story. And stories can be more powerful than facts when they're told the right way. The state's theory was simple. David Camm wanted out of his marriage. He had been unfaithful repeatedly throughout his relationship with Kim. Rather than face the consequences, prosecutors argued, he chose murder. To support that theory, investigators dug through every corner of David's personal life. What they uncovered was embarrassing, damaging, and undeniably real. Over the course of his marriage, David had engaged in numerous affairs and inappropriate relationships. Some involved full-blown affairs. Others involved women he pursued unsuccessfully. The behavior stretched back years. In some cases, it began only months after the wedding. Friends, co-workers, and former romantic partners were brought forward, one after another. The picture that emerged was not flattering. David Camm was not being presented as a grieving husband anymore. He was being presented as a serial cheater, a liar, a man who betrayed his wife repeatedly. And while none of those things proved murder, prosecutors understood something important. Juries are made up of human beings. Human beings often make decisions based on emotion before they realize it. If jurors disliked David enough, perhaps they would be more willing to believe the rest of the state's case. Then came the science, or at least what appeared to be science. When Robert Stites took the stand, he spoke with certainty. The courtroom listened carefully. He explained blood spatter analysis. He explained high-velocity impact stains. He explained how microscopic blood droplets behave when a gun is fired. Then he pointed to the 8 tiny blood spots found on David's shirt. According to Stites, those spots told the entire story. They weren't accidental. They weren't transfer stains. They weren't contamination. They were gunshot blowback. Scientific proof. His words carried enormous weight. Most jurors had no background in forensic science. Most had never heard terms like high-velocity impact spatter. But they understood one thing. An expert was telling them the evidence pointed directly at David Camm. And he wasn't expressing doubt. He wasn't presenting possibilities. He was presenting certainty. The prosecution reinforced that certainty. Additional testimony supported the blood spatter interpretation. Experts described how the droplets supposedly could only have arrived on David's clothing if he had been close to a victim when a gun was fired. The state's message was clear. Forget the alibi. Forget the timeline. Forget the missing weapon. The science says he did it. And science doesn't lie. The defense saw things differently. They argued that the blood spots were being misunderstood. According to their experts, the stains were not gunshot blowback at all. They were transfer stains. A completely different phenomenon that he defense pointed to something investigators had known from the beginning. When David discovered his family, he immediately rushed to them. He touched Kim. He pulled Bradley from the Bronco. He leaned into the vehicle where Jill's body remained. Physical contact had occurred throughout the scene. The defense argued that blood could easily have transferred to David's clothing during those desperate moments. To demonstrate the point, they performed a visual experiment. A blood-soaked wig was brought into court. A shirt was dragged across it. The resulting pattern looked remarkably similar to the stains found on David's shirt. The defense believed the explanation was obvious. The prosecution disagreed. And now the jury faced a choice. Believe the state's experts, or believe the defense's. Then came the witnesses from the basketball game. One by one, they took the stand. 11 men. 11 separate accounts. 11 people who had no apparent reason to lie. Each told essentially the same story. David was there. They saw him. They played with him, talked with him, spent the evening with him. None of them remembered him leaving. None of them noticed an unexplained absence. None of them reported blood on his clothing. The testimony was remarkably consistent. Yet prosecutors urged the jury to look past it. Perhaps the witnesses simply weren't paying attention. Perhaps they missed a brief departure. Perhaps they were mistaken. The state asked jurors to believe that 11 people had all failed to notice the same thing. And despite how improbable that sounded, the jury listened. For weeks, both sides battled over timelines, blood evidence, witness testimony, and motive. By the time closing arguments arrived, the courtroom had become a contest between two competing realities. In one version of events, David Camm was a cheating husband who secretly murdered his family and then returned to a basketball game to create an alibi. In the other version, he was an innocent man whose life had been destroyed by flawed forensic analysis and tunnel vision policing. The jury would decide which version they believed. On March 17, 2002, they reached a verdict. Guilty. 3 counts of murder. The courtroom fell silent. David Camm was sentenced to 195 years in prison. Just 18 months earlier, he had been coaching children, attending church, and living what appeared to be an ordinary family life. Now he was being led away in handcuffs as a convicted family killer. For many people, that should have been the end of the story. Case closed. Conviction secured. Justice served. But hidden inside an evidence room was a gray sweatshirt. The same sweatshirt investigators had largely ignored. The sweatshirt with the word backbone written inside the collar. The sweatshirt that didn't belong to David. The sweatshirt that contained a secret capable of destroying the state's entire case. And within a few years, that secret would begin to surface. When it did, everything would change. Not just for David Camm, but for everyone who had spent years insisting they had the right man. For David Camm, prison was not just punishment. It was confusion. Every morning, he woke up believing the mistake would eventually be corrected. There had to be something investigators missed. Someone had to realize the timeline didn't work. Someone had to look more closely at the evidence. Someone had to notice that 11 witnesses had placed him somewhere else. At first, he believed that day would come quickly. Weeks became months. Months became years. The prison door never opened. The conviction stood. And yet one piece of evidence continued to bother members of the defense team. The gray sweatshirt. The same sweatshirt found beside Bradley's body on the night of the murders. The same sweatshirt that belonged to nobody in the Camm family. The same sweatshirt investigators had never adequately explained. It sat quietly inside an evidence locker while David served time for murders he insisted he did not commit. Eventually, defense attorneys returned to it, and what they found would shake the entire case. In August 2004, the Indiana Court of Appeals overturned David's conviction. The judges concluded that prosecutors had improperly introduced extensive testimony regarding David's affairs. The evidence had painted him as a terrible husband. But being a terrible husband was not proof of murder. The court ruled that the jury had been unfairly influenced. A new trial was ordered. For the first time in years, David's family felt hope. Maybe now investigators would follow the evidence wherever it led. Maybe now the truth would emerge. But before the second trial could begin, defense attorneys focused on the sweatshirt. And this time, they pushed harder. The sweatshirt had always been strange. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't buried. It wasn't discovered years later. It had been sitting in plain sight from the very beginning. Found near one of the victims. Containing DNA that did not belong to David Camm. Containing DNA that did not belong to Kim. Containing DNA that did not belong to either child. And yet somehow it had never become the center of the investigation. The defense wanted answers. Prosecutors insisted the DNA had already been checked. According to the state, there were no useful results. The defense wasn't convinced. Court motions followed. Arguments intensified. Eventually, a judge ordered additional testing. And that decision changed everything. When the DNA profile was submitted properly, investigators didn't have to wait long. A match appeared. Not weeks later. Not months later. Within hours. The DNA belonged to a man named Charles Boney. And Charles Boney was not an ordinary suspect. Far from it. For years, Boney had terrorized women throughout Indiana. His crimes were disturbing, specific, and unusually consistent. He would confront female victims, threaten them, control them. But there was something else. Something investigators immediately recognized. An obsession. Boney had a documented fixation involving women's shoes. Victims repeatedly described being forced to remove them. In several cases, shoes became a central element of the crime itself. The behavior was so unusual that it became part of his identity among investigators. Some even referred to him as the shoe bandit. Now think back to the Camm crime scene. Kim Camm's shoes had been removed. Not tossed aside. Not kicked away during a struggle. Carefully arranged. Side by side. On top of the Bronco. Exactly the kind of bizarre signature investigators search for when identifying offenders. For years, nobody could explain those shoes. Now suddenly, there was a man whose criminal history seemed to explain them perfectly. And his DNA was sitting on the sweatshirt found next to Bradley's body. The discovery forced investigators to take a closer look. The more they examined Boney, the more troubling the situation became. He had recently been released from prison. He was in the area. And then another bombshell arrived. Investigators discovered a palm print on the Bronco. Not David's. Not Kim's. Charles Boney's. The print was found on the passenger side of the vehicle. A physical connection. A direct link between Boney and the murder scene. Now prosecutors faced a problem, not a very serious problem. The evidence was beginning to point somewhere else. Imagine the situation from the public's perspective. A man sits in prison for murdering his family. Then DNA from a mysterious sweatshirt identifies a convicted violent offender. That same offender has a history involving women's shoes. The victim's shoes had been deliberately removed and displayed. A palm print places him at the crime scene. Most people would assume the case was over. Most people would expect the conviction to collapse immediately. Most people would expect David Camm to walk free. That isn't what happened. Instead, prosecutors developed a new theory. One that would keep David in prison. One that would transform Charles Boney from an alternative suspect into something else entirely. According to the state, Boney hadn't acted alone. Investigators brought Boney in for questioning. At first, he denied everything. He denied involvement. Denied knowing David. Denied being at the house. Denied participating in the murders. The sweatshirt? He claimed he had donated it. Nothing more. Nothing less. But as questioning continued, his story began to evolve. Then it evolved again. And then again. With each version, new details appeared. Old details disappeared. And somehow, the revised stories always seemed to move investigators closer to the conclusion they wanted. David Camm remained at the center. Eventually, Boney admitted something important. He acknowledged being connected to the crime scene. But instead of portraying himself as the killer, he claimed he had merely been involved in a gun transaction. According to Boney, David had approached him and requested an untraceable firearm, a weapon that supposedly would leave no connection back to its owner. Boney claimed he delivered the gun. Then came the most extraordinary part of his story. He said he happened to be present when the murders occurred, not as the killer, not as a participant, simply as a witness. A witness who just happened to leave behind DNA, just happened to leave behind a palm print, and just happened to have a criminal history matching one of the strangest details of the crime scene. The explanation stretched credibility, but prosecutors embraced it because it preserved their original theory. David Camm remained guilty. Boney simply became his accomplice. Then another witness entered the picture, a woman named Mara Mattingly, Boney's girlfriend. Her account painted a very different picture. According to Mara, Boney left home on the night of the murders claiming he was helping a friend. Hours later, he returned. He appeared exhausted, sweaty, out of breath, nervous, agitated, and then he showed her a gun. Not long afterward, investigators would conclude that the weapon he displayed could have been the murder weapon, the same murder weapon that has never been recovered. Mara later told investigators she believed something was wrong. Something had changed in him. And when she described his behavior that night, it sounded far more consistent with a guilty man than an innocent witness. By now, the case had become far larger than a wrongful conviction. Questions were emerging everywhere. Why hadn't the DNA been pursued earlier? Why had investigators focused so intensely on David while evidence pointing elsewhere sat in storage? Why did every new discovery seem to strengthen the case against Charles Boney? And perhaps most importantly, if Boney was involved, how much of the original investigation had been wrong? The answers would become even more disturbing. Because the second trial was approaching, and prosecutors were preparing to ask another jury to convict David Camm. Despite DNA, despite fingerprints, despite a growing mountain of questions, the fight was far from over. In fact, it was about to become even uglier. By the time the second trial approached, the case against David Camm looked very different from the one presented to the first jury. The gray sweatshirt had changed everything. The DNA no longer pointed toward an unknown individual. It pointed toward a real person, a convicted violent offender, a man with a documented history of crimes involving women and shoes, a man whose palm print had been found on the victim's vehicle, a man who admitted being connected to the crime scene. Under normal circumstances, that kind of discovery would have completely transformed an investigation. Instead, prosecutors adapted. The original theory wasn't abandoned. It was expanded. Now they argued there had been two men involved, David Camm and Charles Boney. The problem was proving it. When Charles Boney took the witness stand, he became the centerpiece of the state's new case. Jurors listened carefully. After all, this wasn't an expert discussing bloodstains. This was the man whose DNA had been found at the scene. The man connected to the sweatshirt. The man connected to the Bronco. The man many people believed was the actual killer. And now he was pointing directly at David Camm. Boney claimed David had recruited him. According to his story, David wanted a gun that couldn't be traced back to him. Boney supposedly obtained the weapon and agreed to deliver it. He insisted he never intended for anyone to be killed. He portrayed himself as a reluctant participant who became trapped in events beyond his control. The story sounded dramatic. It also raised countless questions. Questions prosecutors preferred not to emphasize. One of the biggest problems was consistency, because Boney's story hadn't remained the same. In fact, it had changed repeatedly. Early in the investigation, he denied involvement entirely. Then he denied knowing David. Then he acknowledged knowing David. Then he admitted being present. Then he offered new details. Then those details changed again. The more investigators questioned him, the more his account seemed to evolve. Defense attorneys argued that his story wasn't developing because he was remembering events. It was developing because investigators were helping shape it. They argued Boney was telling prosecutors what they wanted to hear. And what prosecutors wanted to hear was simple: anything that kept David Camm in the case. The defense highlighted another problem. There was no evidence connecting David and Boney prior to the murders. No meaningful phone records. No letters. No financial transactions. No witnesses describing a close relationship. No documented planning. No clear link suggesting the two men had worked together. Yet jurors were being asked to believe they had somehow formed a conspiracy to commit one of the most brutal family murders in Indiana history. The state insisted it happened. The defense insisted it was speculation. And the battle intensified. Then prosecutors introduced a new motive. A shocking allegation. One designed to explain why David would supposedly kill his own family. The theory suggested David had committed the murders to conceal misconduct involving his young daughter. The accusation was explosive. If true, it would provide a motive far more powerful than marital problems or infidelity. But there was a major issue. There was no physical evidence supporting it. No medical evidence. No forensic findings. No documented history. Nothing. The defense's experts testified that there was absolutely no scientific basis for the allegation. Yet once an accusation like that enters a courtroom, it can be difficult to erase from a juror's mind. Even when evidence is absent, even when experts reject it, the suggestion alone can have tremendous impact. And prosecutors knew it. Meanwhile, troubling information about the original investigation continued to surface. People who had worked on the case began speaking more openly. Some described pressure. Others described disagreements. Questions emerged regarding how evidence had been interpreted and presented. But perhaps the most troubling testimony came from inside the crime laboratory itself. A DNA analyst testified about interactions she had experienced while working on the case. According to her account, she had been pressured to support conclusions that the evidence did not support. The allegation was serious, extremely serious. Because forensic science is supposed to follow evidence wherever it leads, not wherever prosecutors want it to lead. She maintained that the testing simply did not place David Camm's DNA on the sweatshirt. No matter how many times it was examined, no matter how many tests were performed, the results remained the same. Yet pressure allegedly continued. The implications were staggering. If true, it suggested that the pursuit of a conviction had begun overriding the pursuit of truth. Questions also emerged regarding other evidence: a palm print, investigative decisions, witness handling, the overall direction of the case. Individually, each issue raised concerns. Collectively, they painted a troubling picture. A picture of an investigation that may have become emotionally invested in a conclusion it no longer wanted to reconsider. Still, despite the growing controversy, the trial moved forward. Weeks of testimony passed. Witnesses, investigators, analysts, and Charles Boney himself. Jurors listened to experts. Then they retired to deliberate. For David Camm, the wait was agonizing. He had already lost years of his life. The DNA evidence had emerged. The alternative suspect had been identified. Surely that would be enough. Surely jurors would see the reasonable doubt. Surely they would recognize how much uncertainty remained. But that isn't what happened. The verdict arrived. Guilty. Again. Life without parole. A second conviction. A second devastating defeat. Another courtroom loss for a man who insisted he had done nothing wrong. As the verdict was read, many observers were stunned. How could a case containing DNA from another man, fingerprints from another man, and a history matching the crime scene still end with David Camm convicted? Yet that was exactly what happened. The state had won again, at least temporarily, because outside the courtroom, a new set of problems was beginning to emerge. Problems involving prosecutors, conflicts of interest, professional conduct, and revelations that threatened to undermine confidence in the entire case. The fight wasn't over, not even close. In fact, the most explosive chapter of the David Camm story was still ahead, and it would eventually expose flaws far bigger than a single wrongful conviction. It would force people to ask whether the system itself had become part of the problem. After the second conviction, David Camm returned to prison. Another guilty verdict, another crushing sentence, another courtroom declaring that he had murdered the three people he loved most. By then, nearly 6 years had passed since the night Kim, Bradley, and Jill were killed. Most defendants would have run out of options. Most cases would have ended there. But David's attorneys refused to quit. And as they dug deeper into the investigation, they kept finding things that didn't make sense. Little cracks in the foundation, then larger cracks, then entire sections of the state's case that appeared ready to collapse. One of the biggest controversies involved the prosecution itself. While David was fighting for his freedom, his legal team discovered something astonishing. Prosecutor Keith Henderson had entered into an agreement to write a book about the case. Not after the case was over, not years later, while he was actively prosecuting it. The revelation stunned many observers. The concern wasn't simply that a book existed. The concern was that a prosecutor's personal financial interests could become intertwined with a criminal prosecution. The appearance of a conflict was impossible to ignore. David's defense team argued that Henderson had a personal stake in keeping the case alive. The longer the saga continued, the more valuable the story became. The issue eventually reached higher courts, and it created yet another cloud hanging over the conviction. At the same time, troubling questions continued surfacing about the original investigation. Questions that never seemed to go away. Questions that became harder to dismiss with each passing year. Why had investigators ignored the significance of Charles Boney's DNA for so long? Why had the sweatshirt not become the centerpiece of the case immediately? Why had evidence supporting Boney's involvement repeatedly taken a back seat to evidence aimed at David? The answers were never entirely satisfying, and public confidence in the prosecution continued to erode. Then attention shifted back to the forensic evidence. Specifically, the evidence that had started everything. The 8 tiny blood spots. Those microscopic stains had helped convince 2 separate juries. Those stains had been described as scientific proof. Those stains had sent David Camm to prison. But what if the science behind them was wrong? Or worse, what if the expert behind them wasn't qualified to make those conclusions in the first place? For years, Robert Stites had presented himself as a highly trained forensic specialist. He spoke with authority. He testified with confidence. He projected expertise. Jurors listened because he sounded like someone who knew exactly what he was talking about. That confidence became one of the strongest weapons in the prosecution's arsenal. But as defense investigators examined his background more closely, serious problems began to emerge. The credentials he had presented weren't what they appeared to be. Claims regarding his education became the subject of scrutiny. Claims regarding his expertise came under attack. And the deeper investigators looked, the more troubling the picture became. By the time preparations began for a third trial, the state's forensic foundation was weakening rapidly. Independent experts re-examined the blood evidence. Unlike earlier proceedings, advances in testing and microscopic analysis allowed a much closer look at the stains. The results were devastating for the prosecution. The blood spots no longer appeared consistent with the explanation that had been presented to earlier juries. Instead, experts found evidence suggesting direct contact. Transfer, not airborne gunshot missed. Not high-velocity blowback. Transfer, a completely different interpretation. And one that perfectly matched David's explanation from the very beginning. He had touched the victims. He had reached into the Bronco. He had attempted to save his son. If that explanation was correct, then the central forensic claim supporting the prosecution simply disappeared. Then came perhaps the most shocking development of all. Robert Stites himself, the man whose testimony had helped secure convictions, the man who had spoken with certainty, the man who had assured jurors that science proved David's guilt, now found himself facing questions he could no longer avoid. During the years following the earlier trials, his credibility had been shattered. His qualifications were exposed. His conclusions challenged. His testimony dismantled piece by piece. What once appeared solid now looked alarmingly fragile. Observers who followed the case closely began asking a painful question. Had an innocent man spent years in prison because jurors trusted someone who never should have been treated as an expert in the first place? It was a terrifying possibility, and one that was becoming harder to dismiss. As these revelations accumulated, the second conviction could no longer withstand scrutiny. Appellate courts examined the record. They reviewed the allegations. They reviewed the conduct of the prosecution. They reviewed the evidence. And eventually the conviction fell. For the second time, David Camm would receive another trial. A third trial. A final chance. By now, 13 years had passed since the murders. 13 years. 13 years of courtrooms. Appeals. Headlines. Prison cells. Family devastation. And public controversy. The case that once looked straightforward had become one of the most debated wrongful conviction cases in America. But the most important question still remained unanswered. Who killed Kim, Bradley, and Jill Camm? And when the third trial finally began in 2013, that question would finally take center stage. For the first time, the jury would hear the full story. Not just the state's version. Not just the defense's version. The full story. Including evidence that earlier juries never fully heard. Including the collapse of the blood-spatter testimony. Including the evidence pointing toward Charles Boney. And when deliberations finally began, the outcome would be dramatically different from the first two trials. After 13 years, the case was finally approaching its conclusion. By 2013, the case against David Camm barely resembled the one that had first sent him to prison. What began as a seemingly straightforward prosecution had transformed into a cautionary tale about tunnel vision, questionable forensic testimony, and the dangers of becoming too committed to a single theory. For 13 years, prosecutors had insisted they had the right man. For 13 years, David had maintained the same story. He did not kill his family. He never changed his account. He never confessed. He never admitted involvement. And now, at long last, a third jury would decide his fate. But unlike the previous juries, this one would hear evidence that dramatically altered the landscape of the case. The trial was moved away from Floyd County. That decision mattered. For years, local publicity had saturated the area. People had formed opinions. Rumors had circulated. Many residents already believed they knew exactly what happened. A fresh jury in a new location offered something David had rarely received: a clean slate. When proceedings began, the defense immediately targeted the foundation of the prosecution's case: the blood evidence. The same 8 tiny stains that had helped secure 2 convictions. For years, those droplets had been presented as scientific certainty. Jurors had been told they could only have originated from gunshot blowback. They had been told David must have been standing near one of the victims when a gun fired. But now the defense had better tools, better technology, and some of the most respected forensic experts available. The stains were examined under powerful microscopes. The results were stunning. Embedded within the blood were microscopic fabric fibers. Tiny fibers trapped inside the stains themselves. That detail changed everything. Because blood traveling through the air from a gunshot doesn't trap fabric fibers that way. Direct contact does. Physical contact. Transfer. The exact explanation David had offered since the night of the murders. The exact explanation investigators had rejected. The exact explanation prosecutors had spent years attacking. Now the science supported it. The courtroom watched as experts carefully explained the findings. Unlike dramatic television crime shows, real forensic science is often slow and technical. But the implications were impossible to miss. If the blood was transferred through contact rather than gunfire, the prosecution's central argument collapsed. The evidence no longer placed David at the moment of the murders. Instead, it supported the possibility that the blood reached his shirt while he was desperately trying to help his family. a possibility that had existed from the very beginning. Then attention shifted to Robert Stites, and what emerged was devastating. For years, Stites had projected authority. He had testified as though his conclusions were beyond dispute. His confidence had influenced investigators, prosecutors, and jurors alike. But now the image was falling apart. Questions about his credentials became impossible to ignore. Questions about his expertise. Questions about how he reached his conclusions. Questions about whether those conclusions had ever been reliable at all. One by one, the pillars supporting his testimony crumbled. What had once sounded like certainty increasingly looked like overconfidence. And in a criminal case, that difference can mean the difference between freedom and a prison cell. The defense didn't stop there. They returned to Charles Boney, the man whose DNA was found on the sweatshirt, the man whose palm print appeared on the Bronco, the man whose criminal history mirrored some of the most unusual aspects of the crime scene. Jurors heard about the evidence connecting him to the murders. They heard about his shifting stories. They heard about the inconsistencies. They heard about the fact that his explanations seemed to change whenever new evidence emerged. For the first time, the jury received a fuller picture of how much evidence pointed toward Boney. And the more complete that picture became, the harder it became to ignore. Meanwhile, the prosecution found itself in an increasingly difficult position. Much of what had convinced previous juries no longer carried the same weight. The blood evidence was weakened. The credibility of key testimony was weakened. The alternative suspect was no longer a mysterious possibility. He was a real person tied directly to the scene. Every day of testimony seemed to move the case further away from certainty and closer to doubt. And in a criminal trial, doubt matters. Because prosecutors aren't required to show that a defendant might be guilty. They must prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That standard exists for a reason. And after 13 years, reasonable doubt was everywhere. As closing arguments approached, both sides understood the significance of the moment. For David Camm, it was more than another trial. It was a chance to reclaim a life that had been taken from him. More than a decade had disappeared behind prison walls. His reputation had been destroyed. His career had ended. His family was gone. And all that remained was the fight to prove he wasn't responsible. For prosecutors, the stakes were equally enormous. A third loss would force difficult questions about everything that had happened since September 2000. Questions about decisions. Questions about priorities. Questions about whether the wrong man had been prosecuted for more than a decade. Then the case went to the jury. 13 years of investigation. Thousands of pages of testimony. 3 separate trials. Countless motions. Countless appeals. All reduced to one final decision. The jury entered deliberations. And unlike the previous juries, they didn't need days to reach a conclusion. The decision came quickly. Very quickly. On October 24, 2013, David Camm returned to the courtroom. The tension was overwhelming. Everyone knew what was at stake. The jury filed into their seats. The verdict form was handed to the judge. And then the words finally came. Not guilty. Not guilty on all counts. After 13 years, the prosecution's case had failed. The nightmare was over. David Camm collapsed into the arms of his supporters. The emotional weight of more than a decade seemed to hit all at once. Years of frustration. Years of anger. Years of grief. Years of waiting. All released in a single moment. For the first time since his arrest, he walked out of a courtroom as a free man. But freedom could not restore what had been lost. Kim was still gone. Bradley was still gone. Jill was still gone. The verdict did not bring them back. It did not erase 13 years. It did not erase the damage. And perhaps most troubling of all, it left behind a question that continues to haunt the case today. How did it take 13 years to reach this point? How did evidence pointing toward Charles Boney sit in the shadows for so long? How did flawed forensic testimony become powerful enough to secure 2 convictions? And how many lives were permanently altered because investigators became committed to proving a theory instead of testing it? The David Camm case remains one of the most controversial wrongful conviction cases in modern American history. Not because the truth was hidden, but because so many warning signs were visible from the beginning. The gray sweatshirt, the DNA, the palm print, the impossible timeline, the 11 alibi witnesses. The questions were always there. The tragedy is how long it took people to listen. Jill Camm was 35 years old. Bradley was 7. Jill was 5. They deserved justice. And after everything that happened, many people still debate whether true justice was ever fully achieved. Because while David Camm eventually regained his freedom, no verdict could undo the years that were taken. And no verdict could change the fact that one of the most devastating family murder cases in Indiana history became a lesson in how easily an investigation can lose its way when certainty arrives before the truth. If you love the true crime stories we share, subscribe to the Crime Vault to stay updated as we upload new intriguing cases. Thank you for watching.